Hey, today we've got an important subject to discuss here. We're going to talk about illustrations. Okay, so in any sermon, you can't just preach text of the sermon. You need to dress this thing up. You need to have illustrations. Illustrations are stories, anecdotes, things that shed some light on your text. And also, they're very important because they bring your audience into the text. You know, sometimes people just can't relate to Bible times and what the apostles did or the patriarchs or anything like that. So you need to have stories, quotes, this type of thing that will shed some light on it. So I am using the outline that's on the website, so you can take a look at that. And I'll be following that and just adding my own notes here. So we're going to talk about the proper use of illustrations today. Got a little definition there for you. To illustrate means to make clear, especially by examples or drawings. To adorn with pictures, and it comes from the Latin word illustrare, to throw into brightness. Well-chosen, skillfully used illustrations restate, explain, validate, or apply ideas by relating them to tangible experiences. An illustration, like the picture on television, makes clear what the speaker explains. That's from Dr. Haddon Robinson, who's the author of our textbook that we have for this course. So illustrations are really, really important. There will be times where people will come to one of your sermons and you've done all this work, you've done all this exegesis, and they'll shake your hand at the door and say, that was an incredible story you told. And you think, oh, I hope they got the text too. But don't worry. If they got the story, they'll probably make a connection there with the text as well. But sometimes the story itself, the illustration, is the bright moment that connects your person in the audience, in the congregation, to the text you're preaching from. So let's talk a little bit about illustrations, some important aspects of them. First of all, they should be understandable. Okay, know your audience, read your room. If you're doing a talk to children, okay, don't be using great big vocabulary words or stories that are from the business world or something like that. That's not going to be something that little children are going to be able to relate to. You know, don't perform integral calculus to a group at a seniors luncheon. You know, just kind of read your room. You need to know that your illustration needs to be understandable. People need to know what you're talking about. Sometimes we fall into the habit of using our hobby horses. I love sports. You know, the temptation for me is to just use every illustration from the sporting world. But then you got people out in your congregation, don't give a whit about sports, don't care about it, don't even like it. It's like, oh, here's Horban again ragging on about sports. I'm not even interested in that. And it can be kind of a cutoff point for them. So it's very important to be understandable, but also to use some variety in your illustrations. It should be convincing, okay? When I say convincing, I don't mean that you embellish on the details, okay? It's very important not to use urban legends, not to fake stuff and make things up. That's a very dangerous thing to do, actually. Our world today struggles a lot with plagiarism and then also urban legends and folklore and stuff off social media that's not even true. Be very, very careful about that. I might say something about that later, but make sure it's convincing too, so that when you're sharing a story, it's going to hit home to people. And the best kind of illustrations are the ones that you know and the person in your audience knows. I'll talk about that in just a minute. The illustration should be appropriate to the theme and setting. So if you're preaching in Advent, okay, Christmas season, sprinkle some stories in there about some of your Christmas, traditions or something like that, if it fits. Link your theme with the stories with that theme. So people want, if you're preaching in Advent, like a Christmas season, people want to hear a good Christmas story. You know, they want to hear a good anecdote about something that happened at Christmas morning at your house, or a meal you had with your family, or some tradition that you have. People lock right into that. And I'll tell you something, when they do, they're ripe for fitting into, receiving from your text. And so definitely it should be appropriate to the theme and the setting. You should also tell a story dramatically. If there's an intensity about it, like I'll using an example of sports. If it's about a race and you don't know, you're trying to tell about this guy and he fell down the race, and you want your audience to feel like they're there and they're living that moment, and so you should tell it dramatically. Don't go above and beyond your own personality. But I'm an extrovert. Doesn't take anything for me to kind of get worked up about something. People kind of know that. I don't have any problem talking dramatically or sharing dramatically about a story, but don't make it up. Don't be fake about it. But at the same time, if it's not told dramatically, and if not every illustration is dramatic. Sometimes an illustration is a quote, okay, from Shakespeare or some other form of classic literature. So that doesn't necessarily have to be dramatic in the sense that you get all emotional, but certainly there should be something behind it so that people connect with you on that. Let's talk about these types of illustrations. I kind of alluded to that earlier. The most powerful illustration is the one where you are a first person to the situation, and so is your audience. Let's call that S1 and L1, speaker, listener. Okay, it means that the story you're telling was experienced by both you and your listener. Let me give you an example. Let's just say you're doing a sermon about grief. Okay. Maybe when Lazarus died, John chapter 11, Lazarus died, and Mary and Martha were grief stricken. They went and they wept before Jesus. Martha met him while he said she wept. And if you'd been here, his brother would not have died, and this type of thing. So you're talking grief. You want to illustrate about the deep grief that she felt. And then you say something like this. Remember 2 weeks ago at the Remembrance Day service in our community when we were there and we went at the cenotaph, and there was that lady there, and she talked about her son who had died in Afghanistan. And, it was a very emotional time as she laid the wreath. And so right there, that's an S1, L1 illustration. It means the speaker was there and experienced that thing firsthand, and the listener was there. So when you say that it was something in your community, and it's like, yeah, I was there that day too. Yes, that was an emotional time. Boy, that really tugged at my heart. And then you can just wrap that around and say, this is what Martha was feeling. That deep grief after her brother died. And then when she met Jesus, she just was pouring out her heart to him. That's a powerful illustration. When the speaker and the listener both have experienced that situation, you draw a story or some material from that. That's your best illustration. I would say, as much as you possibly can, try to use those types of illustrations. Now, it may not even be possible. Certain passages you're preaching from, it may not even be possible. However, that's the best kind. The second best kind is when an S1, L2. In other words, it's personal to the speaker. Like, I was there, but I'm telling you about it secondhand. For instance, different times I went to the Holy Land in 1998. I went to Israel, so I'd be preaching from something like when when they fished all night and didn't catch any fish, Luke chapter 5, and I could say, I was at that place. And in fact, I was on one of those replica boats because they excavated in 1986. They excavated and found one of the fishing boats from that time, and they've restored it. And so now they have replica boats, and they take people on these boats to experience going on the Sea of Galilee. So you may be preaching from Luke chapter 5, where they fished all night, didn't catch anything. And so you talk about what was like to be on the Sea of Galilee. And I could say, I was there. I was on one of these, a boat just like the same dimensions that Peter and James and John had. We went on there, and there was even a person on the boat that demonstrated how they threw the fishing net over. So you weren't there, your audience person wasn't there, but you bring them into your experience because you were there. So it's first person to you, the speaker. It's second person to the listener, but you bring them into it. So that's also a very good illustration, because those people know you. You say, well, I haven't been to the Holy Land, but I know my pastor was, and he said these things, he experienced it. So that's also, it's not as good as if both parties were there, but it's still pretty good. The third type of illustration, which is arguably is the most common, you might get this from news headlines or this type of thing, is when it's second person to both the speaker and the listener. In other words, I read something in the news, or I saw this video on the nightly news last night about this guy, and there was a standoff at his apartment building, and might be preaching a message about fear. I talk about that. These people were trapped in the apartment. There was a standoff, and this gunman was holding him hostage. And you say, well, yeah, I saw that on the news too, or so I'm relating something. I wasn't there, but I heard about it, or I saw some video footage of it, and the listener may or may not have seen the video footage. But again, it's still a good story, and we can relate to it, and it can shed some light on our text. But it's not as good as if it wasn't a personal thing to you. So illustration is really, really. I want to give some points of caution here with illustration. So I did say earlier in this talk that you can't just have text, right? You can't have just a text because it's just dry, and we're going to, in another session, we're going to talk about delivery do's and don'ts. So depending on how good your voice is and your delivery, boy, if you're dry and then you don't have any illustrations, people are going to check out mentally. They're going to hang in there for a minute or two, and it's like, man, this guy's got nothing to say. So this is why it's important to have illustrations, because it relates the text to everyday life. Having said that, there's a danger of over illustrating your message, okay? So I'm going to say that I'm using the outline here, points of caution. Don't overuse illustrations to the detriment of the message. So it needs to be mostly text, and then highlighted and illumined here and there with a good story, a good anecdote, a good quote, okay? Don't overuse that, because if that's all it is, people won't remember what the text was or what the point of your message was. All they'll remember is one or two of the stories, and it won't be able to connect the dots. So be careful not to overuse illustrations. I'll be honest with you. Sometimes I'm preaching on a text and think, oh man, there's so many good stories I could share on this, and I kind of have to hold back and not tell every story that I wanted to tell. We do an online sermon in our church ever since the pandemic started. And then we went back to the in-house. I do an online sermon earlier on, and then so there's been times where I came up or found an illustration between the time I taped the online service and then the time I preached it. So it's a different, and I'll do that. I'll share a different story just because I didn't have that earlier, but I'm going to use it now. But just use your judgment on that. You want to use illustrations, you just don't want to use too many. Second point I want to make about this point of caution: carefully research all real life illustrations to make sure they're true. And I said that earlier. You can go on Snopes.com. There's another good site called www.truthorfiction.com. Truthorfiction.com. If you read a story or hear about something, say on social media, and think, wow, that's good. Man, it's almost so good. It's almost too good to be true. Probably is. Check it out on Snopes.com or truthorfiction.com. And they've done their homework there to let you know that, yeah, this was a pretty good sounding story, but yeah, it's not true. So you got to be really careful when you're up there and you're expounding your text, and then you say and you talk about this story as if it really happened. And if your listeners find out sometime later that, man, that was a made up thing, this is going to discredit your preaching. They're going to say, why, he didn't do his research. Like he went and told an urban legend there, and he made it sound like it was the real thing. So it's really important that you don't just read from somebody or secondhand for it. You read it, and just because I'll give you this warning, just because someone you trusted said it doesn't mean it was true. They could have made the same mistake you're making I got it from somebody who got it from somebody, and they're all reputable people. Hey, reputable people don't always do their research, and then guess what? Now they're not as reputable. So it's absolutely imperative that you make sure the material you have is true. Here's another one. Don't take credit for an illustration if it's original to someone else. Don't say, last week, I was down at the high school track and I set the Ontario record for the 3,000 meter steeplechase. Okay, no, you didn't. Okay, don't make a claim about yourself that wasn't true. Okay, it's very, very important. Somewhere, somehow, a bird on the wing is going to take your lie, and you're going to be found out. So it's critical that you don't take credit for something. This is why when you do a quote, I'm going to tell you this right now. Don't wing it with a quote. If I were you, I would write the quote out, even if it's short. No, if it's really short, no problem. Okay. I can quote John 11 verse 30, Jesus wept. Okay, I don't have to worry about that. But if it's too long to remember, write it down in your sermon notes and say, Chuck Swindoll was preaching one time in Texas, and he said this about greed, and then quote it. Make sure you cite that it was Swindoll. Read exactly what he said, okay, and don't embellish on it, don't add or take away from it. And make sure that you cite those sources. So don't wing it. So there's nothing worse than a good quote and we bungle it, or we fudged it because we thought it said this, and then you can change the meaning of the quote quickly with just the changing of a few words. So be very, very careful with that. Another point here: get permission from friends and family if you intend to use them as an illustration. Oh boy, am I guilty on this. As a family, my kids are built-in sermon illustrations, So over the years, I'll be honest, I have not asked their permission. There's been times I said stuff and they get said afterward, like, Dad, I didn't want people in the church to know that. Oh, you embarrassed me. Oh, and I thought it was funny. The congregation thought it was funny. But hey, I embarrassed my kids. So my kids are all adults now, so they can give me a knuckle sandwich if I don't get their permission these days. But really, it's just common courtesy, especially if it's your family. But other people too. Don't be going and citing someone, because nowadays people film stuff, especially for me, if I do an online service, my goodness, it's going on the internet. I had better get permission from someone if it's something that's not public information, if it's a personal thing, don't ever share something confidentially. If you want to say, if I was to say I was 5 years ago, I was counseling a man who came to me and he was having a real problem with his anger. I'm not mentioning his name, I'm not mentioning the circumstances, I'm not mentioning the date. I can say something like that, and that's okay. But don't say, hey, I remember one time John Doe came to talk to me about his anger problem. It was in the summer of 1998, and man, he was, okay, hold it here. We got to be really, really careful about that. So get permission. I'm going to make one other point here that's not on your handout, okay? And I added this because it just came to me. I thought, I'm seeing this one abused a lot. And here it is. Beware of overusing PowerPoint stuff and other visual aids, little movie clips, and things like that, other multimedia things. I have seen this to the detriment of good sermons that just sort of went, ugh. They kind of just bled out because the pastor kept interrupting his own sermon to pop up some funny thing or some multimedia thing, and people were more enamored and really distracted by all these images, and you get lost in translation there. You can't say, well, where was he? What was the point he was trying to make of it? I'm not saying that don't use them at all. Sometimes a well-timed movie clip, a minute, it shouldn't be too long either. It's just a short thing, okay? Enough to just whet appetite. So a well-timed movie clip, or some other multimedia thing, or something with your PowerPoint, it can be very, very good. But overusing it, boy, it goes south really, really quickly. So I just want to warn you on that. We're living in a day and age where we're bombarded with a lot of things. People have images. We've forgotten to know how to listen. Let's face it. People who come to the pew on Sunday morning, they've been in a world where they had all sorts of multimedia and fast this, that, and everything, and technology, and then they got to listen to you. So you're tempted to try to keep them interested by bombarding them with lots of stuff visually, but just be careful about that because it can easily take away from your message. So use illustrations. You got to have them in your sermon, but a proper use of them is mandatory because it can be the difference between enhancing your message or ruining it.